The Mexican army of that day was hardly an organization. The private soldier was picked up from the lower class of the inhabitants when wanted. His consent was not asked. He was poorly clothed, worse fed, and seldom paid. He was turned adrift when no longer wanted. The officers of the lower grades were but little superior to the men. With all this, I have seen as brave stands made by some of these men as I have ever seen made by soldiers. Now, Mexico has a standing army larger than that of the United States. They have a military school modeled after West Point. Their officers are educated and no doubt generally brave. The Mexican War of 1846 to 1848 would be an impossibility in this generation. The Mexicans have shown a patriotism which it would be well if we would imitate in part, but with more regard to truth. They celebrate the anniversaries of Chapultepec and Molino del Rey as of very great victories. The anniversaries are recognized as national holidays. At these two battles, while the United States troops were victorious, it was a very great sacrifice of life compared with what the Mexicans suffered. The Mexicans, as on many other occasions, stood up as well as any troops ever did. The trouble seemed to be the lack of experience among the officers, which led them after a certain time to simply quit, without being particularly whipped, but because they had fought enough. Their authorities of the present day grow enthusiastic over the theme when telling of these victories, and speak with pride of the large sum of money they forced us to pay in the end. With us, now 20 years after the close of the most stupendous war ever known, we have writers who profess devotion to the nation, engaged in trying to prove that the Union forces were not victorious. Practically, they say, we were slashed around from Donelson to Vicksburg and to Chattanooga, and in the east from Gettysburg to Appomattox, when the physical rebellion gave out from sheer exhaustion. There is no difference in the amount of romance in the two stories. I would not have the anniversaries of our victories celebrated, nor those of our defeats made fast days and spent in humiliation and prayer, but I would like to see truthful history written. And that is from the memoirs of Ulysses Grant, 1885. I'm Joshua Treviño, and this is The Hard Country.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hard Country podcast. My name is Melissa Ford, and I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I am joined by Joshua Treviño, our foundation's Chief of Intelligence and Research. Thank you for being here, Josh, and thank you for reading that passage. There's a lot that I want to highlight in that, but first I want to let our listeners know what we've been up to. And Josh and I, we have been visiting Mexico City.
We have.
We just came back from there last week, and it was a very productive time. We had some amazing meetings. But before we go into all of that, there is a lot to unpack. I really want to highlight something that your passage talks about, and then use that to segue into something that we were able to see in Mexico City.
Sure.
So your passage talks about some of the virtues of the Mexican soldiers, right?
Right.
And how a lot of them were such patriots, and they really loved their land and they wanted to fight for their land, but their history, I guess their reputation has been a bit tarnished by maybe some of these military elites. Is that what the passage is kind of trying to summarize?
Yeah, no, good question. And I think this is something worth delving into quite a bit. Grant in his memoirs. So by the way, any American who has not read Grant's memoirs ought to do so. I read them for the first time, I'm a bit embarrassed to say, only about a year and a half ago. And prior to reading them, I would have told you that I understood the outlines of the Civil War fairly well. Afterwards, I realized how little I knew, which truly is one of the great works of American literature. Grant, among his many virtues, and to me, he was one of the greatest Americans ever to live, has a generosity in him toward those whom he faced on the battlefield. This is actually true of Southern soldiers as well in the Civil War. But in this passage, he talks about the individual Mexican soldier and the reality, born from experience, that he perceives them as performing basically as well as the individual American soldier. That the deficiency in kind of Mexican war leadership really resided sort of at the level of the officers and the political class, who had this measure of, he calls quit in them, that when they have enough, they simply quit the field. And so what Grant is trying to communicate here is that there really is not an inferiority of the individual Mexican in arms in his experience in the War of 1846 to 1848. And I think you can extend that really society-wide. What's interesting to me is this belief, and we've talked about this a little bit in this podcast in previous episodes, this belief in the kind of the inferiority of Mexican arms, or even of the Mexican soldier to an extent. You can see it persist in things like the exhibit at the National History Museum at Chapultepec, which asserts that the war between the United States and Mexico was always going to be lost by Mexico because the United States simply had a superior army with superior soldiers. Not necessarily the case. There are times in Mexican history where this mythos gets turned on its head. You see it, for example, there's a very interesting documentary series called Patria, by Paco Ignacio Taibo, who I met, by the way, in Mexico City, just on the street. Met him, and he had no interest in speaking to me, kind of waved me off. But a very interesting sort of leftist public intellectual, and he did this documentary called Patria, which you can find, I think, on YouTube. Just turn on the captions for those of you who don't know Spanish. It's worth watching. But he covers this period, basically, of the Reform Wars and the French occupation of Mexico. And it was very interesting to me rewatching it just in the past 7 days because I had to get my Mexico City content in after returning. As you know, Melissa, it's a city that you miss after you leave it for sure.
Absolutely.
But he talks about the Battle of Puebla, which is the famous Cinco de Mayo, 1862. So May 5th, 1862, they beat the French at Puebla. It's a temporary defeat. Ignacio Zaragoza and his troops defeat the French. By the way, Ignacio Zaragoza, a native-born Texan. There's a statue of him at Goliad because he was born outside the Presidio of Goliad. So anybody who goes to Goliad, in addition to honoring the Texans who fell there during the Texas Revolution, you also get an opportunity to see the birthplace of this great Mexican hero who wins at the Battle of Puebla. But the exhortation that he gives to the Mexican soldiers at Puebla is he praises the French as having the best army in the world. I think that was somewhat debatable in 1862, but we'll roll with it. France is still sort of on the pre-Franco-Prussian War, post-Napoleonic reputational high. And he says to them, men, we're about to face the best army in the world, but we have with us the best sons of Mexico with us. And as Ignacio Taibo tells us, that this had this electrifying effect among the soldiers. And nowadays, you don't necessarily see that as much. There's no, and you and I had conversations in Mexico City like this. There's no culture of honoring those who fell for Mexico in quite the same way. Not to say it doesn't necessarily exist, but it's very context specific. It's the heroic children of Chapultepec, things like that.
Right.
But like an Arlington Cemetery is unthinkable in the Mexican context. So you tell me where you want to go from that. But,
okay, so
it's a rich vein.
No, thank you. But I really think that this is very relevant to something that you saw last week. Unfortunately, I wasn't there to experience it because I got there a few days after you. I would have loved to, but you actually wrote a really interesting, a fantastic publication about the experience that you had visiting the Mexico City National Cemetery.
Sure.
Which doesn't sound like it when you hear it, but it's actually an American cemetery in Mexico.
It is.
To honor, it's the resting place of the fallen American soldiers that died in Mexico. And you visited there. You had a very interesting experience. You met a Mexican family. You met the groundskeeper
right.
of the cemetery. Yeah, the administrator. So do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about that? We're definitely going to link the whole publication for them to read.
Yeah.
But do you want to summarize it?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. The Mexico City National Cemetery is part of a network of U.S. administered and run cemeteries around the world, run by the American Battle Monuments Commission. And so anybody who's ever had the privilege of going to Normandy or to the Meuse-Argonne and seen the American cemeteries there overseas. These cemeteries are typically run by the American Battle Monuments Commission. There's one in North Africa, too, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is universally true, but often the cemeteries are essentially deeded over as sovereign U.S. soil. So the idea is that even though these soldiers are buried in a foreign land, they're still in American soil. And so
like an embassy, kind of.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's sovereign territory. It's an act of graciousness on the host nation's part, for sure. So the Mexico City National Cemetery is founded in 1851, not long after the close of the war in 1848, and it holds several hundred remains of veterans who fought in the Mexico City campaign. Now, there was another campaign up north with Zachary Taylor. I don't believe there's any American cemetery up there. I think those remains were either kind of buried on site and forgotten, which was not uncommon then, or repatriated to the United States. But this cemetery is sovereign U.S. soil. It's quite small. I would say maybe half an acre. I'm not too good at judging
small.
that. It's very small. But it holds several hundred Americans, and it's sort of a relic of days gone by, in the sense that from 1851 at its opening through, I believe, the early 1920s, if you were a veteran, if you were an American veteran, you could be buried at the cemetery. And so it's not just U.S.-Mexico War veterans who were buried there. There's Civil War veterans. Interestingly enough, Confederate soldiers who ended up in Mexico considered American veterans, which is a wise and prudential move on the part of contemporaneous politics. And so you have this very interesting juxtaposition of graves. There's one section of it as you enter on the east side where you can find this U.S. colored trooper who's buried there. He's a man who fought for the United States, ended up in Mexico. There's several Buffalo soldiers who were buried there. And then kind of diagonal to him, there is a Confederate brigadier general who's buried off to the side. And that kind of union and memorialization is really testament, I think, to the generosity and wisdom of the nation at the time that these burials and these interments were conceived. I'm not sure if something like this could exist now, in full candor. There's certainly not going to be an American cemetery in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Oh, right.
The remains are now repatriated home. So all of which is to say, for those who go to Mexico City, it's if you're a U.S. citizen, it's well worth visiting because it's part of your heritage. It's part of our history that we need to understand. But what was interesting in the conversation with the administrator. So this is a gentleman who's a U.S. citizen, and he told me his backstory. Immigrated to the United States when he was 11 years old from, I believe, San Luis Potosí. So he is Mexican by birth, ended up serving for many decades in the United States Army, had another career in the FBI.
Wow.
So really gave of himself to his adopted country.
Yeah.
And now, I don't know if I can call him his retirement years, but certainly after a full career, he is now he's a GS federal employee who is administering this very small cemetery in Mexico City. And what he shared with me was very interesting, which was that he came down with the idea, because he's American, has been in the United States since he was 11.
Right.
He came down with this idea that there was going to be sort of this compatibility of sort of martial cultures and cultures of memorialization
Right.
with the United States and Mexico. And what he's found is that it wasn't true. That his efforts to do, not to put words in his mouth, but his efforts to do joint commemorations to kind of make the cemetery an epicenter of study and remembrance and commemoration on both the U.S. and Mexican side, which is exactly the kind of thing that would happen in France, by the way, was met with effective disinterest from those in power in Mexico. Individual Mexicans, he said, would sometimes wander in off the streets. And they would express surprise. They didn't know there was a U.S. cemetery there, and in his telling, they were all very respectful. I met a Mexican family there, and we actually had a very good conversation. I have ancestors who were present in the Mexican War on both my father's and mother's side, and so we were able to talk about that. But he said that to the extent that kind of Mexican elites engaged with it, it was with this sense of distaste that there's still invaders on Mexican soil. And in the 1970s, and this is publicly documented, there was actually an effort to eradicate the cemetery entirely by the Mexican authorities. They wanted to put a freeway through it, and so the U.S. side said that they would agree to it if there was another cemetery that was allocated. So they'd move the remains outside of Mexico City. But that cemetery also had to be, sovereign U.S. soil and,
Right.
kind of the same terms of engagement as the 1851 internment. And the Mexican state wouldn't do it. So what they ended up doing was putting the freeway through just half of it. And they had to move the bodies from the one half to the
I
other
didn't know
side.
that part.
Which is a signal as to kind of the confusion of memory that's there.
Well, one thing that's very interesting to me, and honestly, I wish I could say it was a little bit more shocking, but you say that there is, I don't know if a lot, but some Mexicans that really disapprove of this, right? They think that the Americans, the invaders, should not still have a place on their soil. And one thing that hadn't really stuck out to me as much as it did on this trip is that there is still so much historical tension between the U.S. and Mexico.
Yeah.
We have had, good relations sometimes. And then when you look back at history, we have had times of cooperation, but we've also had times of a lot of conflict. And there's people that have really hung on to that at all levels. I think that even at the highest levels of the Mexican government, like the president,
including the
still
president,
has so much disdain for the U.S. And I wonder, do you think that some of that has to do with the historical tension there and the history between both countries?
Yeah, well, right. That's the source of it, and we should be clear that it would be inevitable that two countries like the United States and Mexico were always going to have conflicting points. We have very different civic cultures. We have very different cultures of origin. There's not. I mean, just imagine the tension and diversity within the United States. It's kind of the Albion seed thesis of America is made in origin. By individuals who come from what at the time were perceived as very different backgrounds, Scotch-Irish versus English and so on, and it was quite different. So a background in the Mexican case that is explicitly Spanish, explicitly indigenous in many cases, and then the heterogeneity within that indigenous heritage. Tlaxcaltecas and Nahuas are treated very, very differently in lots of ways, and so I think there, from a historical standpoint, there was always going to be this font of tension. That being said, with the amount of prospective points of conflicts that exist, the U.S. and Mexico have actually done pretty well, I would say, in the long run. It may or may not look that way from the Mexican side of things, but I would say from a Texan side, it's we until really the past decade and a half we had arrived kind of at this modus vivendi, which I think was quite good. But to your point, it's interesting to have had the conversations that we did have in Mexico City, kind of over and over and over, with this referentialism toward sort of historic suspicion, historic resentment, historic this and that, and the extent to which that gets. That's a real source of tension versus something that gets instrumentalized to validate something that's existing now, which I think is really the case with the current Mexican president. Varies quite a bit, but it's definitely there.
Yeah, no, absolutely, it's there. And then one other thing that I wanted to talk about that you talk a little bit about in your publication is, do you think that Mexicans have this general sentiment about maybe their fallen soldiers as well? I can tell you, I think that is a sentiment that happens in a lot of countries, not just Mexico. I think largely a lot of Latin America feels that way about their fallen soldiers for different reasons, right? Varying by countries. But why do you think that not all of the Mexican people, but in general, the culture seems to not have a lot of respect? Some of them even have like a disdain for their fallen soldiers. Why do you think that is?
You have mentioned this before in the Bolivian context, which is the one that you're familiar with, and this idea that if you're in law enforcement or if you're a soldier, that you are that and you were in these professions because you were already lower class, and so there's sort of this class condescension. I think that comes into a lot of it. Which may or may not be true. I'm not qualified to say, but at the same time, and then you've got sort of the historical record, right? So I won't speak to Bolivian military history. I only know about one Bolivian war. It's the War of the Pacific, when I guess lost the coastline, right?
Yes.
And so there's
it was very traumatic.
Very traumatic.
Yeah.
The Chileans conquered it, I think. The Atacama, is that right?
Yeah. The Litoral is what we call it.
Oh, really?
And then after that, we had one. We haven't had a war in a very long time, but after that, we had the Guerra del Chaco, which was
versus
almost more traumatic.
Versus the Paraguayans.
Yes, and that was almost more traumatic because we also lost a lot of land, and they were largely the underdogs, and it was, I believe, the bloodiest war in Latin American history. And so
wiped out what, like a third of? I forget the stat, but
I think it was like at least 100,000 people, which is
it
a
gutted
lot.
Paraguay. Yeah,
Yeah,
right, yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So yes, we've had very traumatic wars, and maybe that goes towards explaining why people aren't so proud of their fallen soldiers, because we don't have a lot of victories to be proud of. So I can't speak for the Mexicans, but I think that in Bolivia, maybe some of the lack of respect there is for fallen soldiers. Yes, a lot of it is corruption. Corruption is huge in Bolivia. We know they're involved in the cocaine trafficking. We know they're involved in organized crime, the military, the police, all of it. So it's hard to have respect for historically some of the military when currently the military is so bad, right?
Right.
And then there's also not a lot of patriotism, I think. There's not the same like love for the land and the country that you see in the US, just because of how bad the government is, how bad the leadership is. It's hard to have that love for your country when right now it's not going well.
Right.
We have bad leadership. They're working against the people. And then, like you asked about the wars, I think a large part of it is we're embarrassed about having lost so much in the wars. And so many people are still traumatized by the fact that, like, oh, now we're landlocked because the armed forces allowed it to happen with these underdogs. And, like, a lot of it was bad treaties after the wars. But I think that the U.S. has a lot to celebrate, a lot of victories to be proud of.
Well,
and maybe Mexico doesn't feel that way for that reason.
It depends on the era, and there's still a Bolivian naval establishment, though, isn't there? Like there's actually like a Bolivian admiral for the day that comes when Chile is finally put in this place.
Lake Titicaca.
Oh, really?
That's where they practice and all of it. We still celebrate El Día del Mar, even though we don't have one.
I didn't know that.
And we still have a Miss Litoral.
Really?
It's like a beauty queen, and that's not ours anymore.
That's incredible.
So a lot of people are still holding on. The president, our last president, Evo Morales, one of the things he would always say in speeches is, we're gonna get it back. Like, a lot of people still have a lot of hope that might happen.
1883, though, right? I mean,
it's been a long time. But no
yeah.
one's let it go, and even to this day, Bolivians and Chileans, believe it or not, don't really get along. We don't have good diplomatic relations.
Right.
And even when we were kids and like a little Chilean kid would join the school, people would be really mean to them. So there's still a lot of tension in that relationship.
Amazing. It's like a very dusty Alsace-Lorraine.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, let me push back a little bit on this. It's not just because the United States' victories, to its credit historically, that we have this culture of honoring soldiers. In fact, I would argue that a lot of the most, how would I put it, impressive and significant commemorations of soldiers and the fallen in the American context come with defeats, things like the Alamo.
Right.
There's a reason that the Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C. is so revered and so visited. That was a defeat, and I would also argue that the kind of I think lackluster is the term I'll use, but the lackluster American military record of the past 20 years has not dimmed popular affection for the figure of the soldier in the United States.
I'd say that's true.
And so there's I don't think you're wrong. I mean, obviously we like having positive things to celebrate, but at the same time, consider the War of 1812, which was effectively a strategic draw, but in which we were defeated. The United States was defeated soundly by the Canadians. How embarrassing is that? But they beat us at Queenston Heights. They burned the capital of the U.S., although that might be a charitable act in some sense in 2023. But all of which is to say that there's something else going on, and here's my thesis, which may be wrong, but I'd be curious what you think about. Grant, and again, to go back to the Grant passage. I mean, Grant talks about his perception that there's nothing wrong with the individual Mexican soldier, that it's really the elite class. That elite class is also the narrative myth maker in a Latin American context, especially in a Mexican context. So you can look at the Mexican record in one of a few ways. Particularly in the 19th century, Mexico had to face the armies of Spain, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, which is a pretty tough record. And actually, I would argue the U.S. accepted, they generally did pretty well. They beat the Spanish. They ended up beating the French. The U.K. they kind of saw off, after a brief port bombardment. So it's not actually a record to be ashamed of. I mean, this is not to diminish or to deny any of the sort of societal trauma that attached to it. But why would from this record, you think about if this happened to the United States, if we had a record of like defeating every major Western European power in the 19th century, and maybe we lost one or two, but you can sort of imagine what that would inspire in like old Virginia, for example, or South Carolina. There would be this this celebration of it's our heroes who beat the French, things like that, and that doesn't happen there. So my theory is this. My theory is that this culture doesn't exist, and I'm speaking specifically to Mexico. I won't speak to Bolivia or any other place, because there is a need for this elite class to explain its failure away and to blame somebody else for what is manifestly, what I think Grant accurately showed, was a dysfunction among a class that should have been a leadership class. And I think that continues today.
Yeah.
In the modern Mexican context.
No, I totally agree. And I think a lot of that is relevant in Bolivia as well, and maybe some of the other Latin American countries. But I think we could discuss this for a long time. But
Please.
I really want to continue
ahead.
discussing some of the other things that we learned in Mexico, not last week, but the week before. We had a lot of great, productive conversations with a huge range of different people.
Yes.
But I think that one of the things that we came home with was a lot of those conversations were negative. And a lot of the people that we talked to don't feel very optimistic about the future of the U.S.-Mexico relationship.
That's right.
On the contrary, they don't see it going in a good place. They realize that we are at an all-time low as far as cooperation goes between both countries, but they don't see it getting any better. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah. And of course, we promised everybody that we talked with. So if you spoke with us in Mexico City, thank you. But we told you to be off the record, and it will stay that way. So while honoring the off-the-record promise that we made, because it's so important to be able to have these conversations, I would say it's fair to say that we had a variety of conversations with Americans, with Mexicans, mostly with Mexicans. And then among the Mexicans, a remarkable spectrum of opinion. Left of center intellectuals to kind of conservative academics and journalists and everybody in between. Political types, reporters, fascinating stuff. And honestly, every day, I don't know how you felt about it. Every day, I felt like my brain was full. I couldn't possibly have any more conversations that day, but just it kept going and going and going.
Yeah.
So I'm still processing it 10 days later.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was interesting that despite that spectrum of opinion, and I think a decade ago, thinking back to conversations that I had in Mexico City a decade ago, that there would have been a diversity of views. And now what's remarkable, and to your point, very alarming, is the uniformity of views from all sides, that things are as bad as they have been in over 40 years. Yeah. And that there's no pathway to things getting better. And there seems to be, if I could describe the consensus in broad outline, and then we can dive in on any point that you'd like, Melissa, that there is a belief that the current Mexican regime is semi-permanent, is going to persist at least through the end of this decade. Obviously, the current president, AMLO, is going to be out of power next year in December 2024. He'll hand over to someone else. There's no good options to hand to.
Not a single one.
No, not a single one. I mean, there's three. If I can go into this very briefly, there's three plausible contenders, right? There's Claudia Sheinbaum, who is the mayor of Mexico City, who is effectively what was it in Spanish? You kept saying a puppet. It's
títere.
A títere. Yeah. She's going to be una títere for AMLO.
Yeah,
and
who's going to be pulling the strings.
I actually think, like after the conversations that we've had, I think she's the one who's most likely, because she's viewed as kind of she's going to be the like the Dilma to his Lula.
She won't push back.
She won't push back. He can kind of control her because he doesn't really have any intention of walking off the scene. So there's her. She's hyper progressive. She's super you should follow her on Instagram if you haven't. So I know Instagram is a thing now.
Yeah.
You should follow her on Instagram. What's very interesting is that there's sort of this virtue signaling. You and I haven't discussed this, but it's all just so if you have a different opinion, totally fine. This drives me crazy though. Todos y todas, las y los, like this whole this desire, which is imported straight from English-speaking academia to make Spanish a gender-neutral language.
More inclusive.
Todas, todas,
Oh,
amigues,
gosh. Okay.
all these phrases. It's terrible. And so when you look at Claudia Sheinbaum's Instagram, what she does is she writes todos with an at symbol where the second O should be. And so it's todas y todas, todas y todas. It's pure progressive signaling. And it really signals basically her ideological emptiness, and the fact that she can be controlled. So she's one candidate. The other is Marcelo Ebrard, who is currently promoting a book, Un Camino por Mexico, The Road for Mexico, which no one will read. It's a campaign book. But that he is very well integrated into this Foro de Sao Paulo kind of leftist globalist circle, and is moves among the Castro, I'm sorry, the Castros are gone, but the Cuban regime and the Nicaraguans and Lula and Venezuela and things like that. So he's really part of that Latin America left set. So he's bad news. And then the third candidate, who's kind of a distant third, but still on there, is Adán Augusto, who's the Minister of the Interior, with the equivalent Minister of the Interior, and is on the Guacamaya leaks as having given police files to cartel members in Tabasco.
And isn't he AMLO's cousin?
Yes, which I didn't realize.
Yeah.
He's a family member of AMLO as well, which also sort of should set off a light bulb among people. Thank you for reminding me of that. It's astonishing. But all of which is to say, there's another candidate who's in the Senate, but I don't think anybody takes him too seriously. But all of which is to say, like none of these are good outcomes. And so through at minimum December 2030, you're going to have this corrupt, cartel enmeshed, left-wing, nakedly socialist kind of regime that's going to continue to control Mexico, and is probably going to become more and more and more antagonistic toward the United States. And what I think is going to happen, and I don't say this with any joy at all, is that even on the American left, there's going to be a realization that Mexico, which has had a de facto strategic partnership with the United States, really from you can date it as you wish, but basically 1988-ish all the way through 2018, honestly, has basically dropped out of that role and is now on a much more antagonistic path, not just because of the cartel and corruption, but also from a strategic standpoint as well. And that's going to lead to some very, very negative outcomes. And everybody believes it's going to happen. Nobody is enthusiastic about it. And what was interesting to me was the number of people with whom we spoke, people who I did not think would espouse this view. And so these are, I would say, card-carrying members of the Mexican center-left elite. So they're not in favor of intervention. They're not, pro-Americans. They're real, legit Mexican patriots. And even they were saying, listen, the United States is going to have to put force on the table, basically, stand up for your interests, because we aren't going to respect you until until basically the relationship is militarized to an extent. So go ahead wherever you want to go with that, but I was shocked.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
I think we could do a full episode just talking about the next elections, what that could look like.
Yeah, we could, yeah.
But I think that you're absolutely right when you say there is absolutely no good option on the table right now. And what seems to be the front runner, Claudia Sheinbaum, she's not even liked by the party. From the conversations that I think that we've had, a lot of Morena doesn't seem to like her. People at first were excited, right? Because she's a woman and she's inclusive. She's kind of feeding into this progressive, what we were talking about with inclusion. But the feminists hate her. And that's a conversation that I had in Mexico City, because she's kind of this, what should be an empowered woman, right? But she's allowing someone else to control everything she says, always standing behind the president. Yes, president, no president. So she's not really that kind of empowered woman in that way.
Right.
And a lot of Morena does not like her. So it will be interesting to see if she does end up getting the dedazo, what they call the dedazo from AMLO.
Finger, yeah.
Or not. we'll definitely like keep our listeners updated on some of the changes that happen in Mexican politics. But I think that what we were saying with how a lot of people aren't optimistic about this next election and aren't optimistic about U.S.-Mexico relations in general, I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the Mexican people in general are still optimistic about the future of Mexico. Even with, everything, all the uncertainties of the next election and maybe some things that may happen with the U.S. And this was really fascinating to me. We've talked about this general sentiment before, but we heard it a lot in Mexico City. And the reason that they're still optimistic about the future of Mexico is because of the U.S. And this is something that was repeated to us, but people say, I feel like it doesn't matter how bad it gets here in Mexico. Like, the U.S. is not going to let it get that bad.
Right.
It's not in their best interest.
Right.
And this is the Mexican people thinking that the U.S. is always going to be there to rescue them.
Yeah.
Do you think that they should maybe rethink that faith in the U.S.? Because we don't know where the U.S. is going either.
Yeah. No, that's I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, this is a phenomenon that was pointed out to me years back, and I can't say I took it as seriously as I should have at the time, by our friend David Agran in Mexico City, who said to me, and this is his phrase, he said, you would be surprised at the extent to which there is a section of Mexican public opinion and Mexican elite opinion that wants the United States to pursue a pro-consular policy vis-a-vis Mexico. That, oh yeah, man, we hate the Americans intervening. They should mind their own business. It's, we're a sovereign country. Soberania over and over. There's all these, you probably saw them too.
Yeah.
All these posters about Soberania all over Mexico
yes,
City, and they got AMLO's face, and he's sort of like walking into this very dark future that he's creating. But at the same time, there's a belief that, the United States is going to make it okay. Like, no matter what crazy thing happens, we're not going to be Venezuela. So
Right.
where I first heard this, you may have heard it in other conversations, where I first heard it 10 days ago, was in this idea that is Mexico going to become Venezuela? Because right now, AMLO and the Morenistas really are pursuing
It's headed that way.
the Venezuela template in Mexico, which I don't think is an overstatement. I would have said before our meetings, that was an overstatement. I would have said, he's authoritarian and things like that, but it's not going to Venezuela. Now I'm fully convinced that I was wrong about that.
Me too.
They really are pursuing this Venezuela template with Cuban help. Which we should also talk about, but all of which is to say, when you ask, is this going to happen? Like, is Mexico going to become Venezuela? There's exactly what you say, which is a sense that, we won't be Venezuela because in the end, the United States won't allow it. And that is I think, I don't remember if we've talked about this on the podcast before. I think we may have in one of the earlier episodes, but we had this meeting in 2019 where we talked with some Mexican business leaders, and we asked them, what do you do when you want to change policy in Mexico? And they said the first thing we do is we get on an airplane to Washington, D.C., get signatures from Hispanic caucus members, and then we fly back to Mexico City because they don't take us seriously unless we have evidence of U.S. Interest and involvement and things like that. And that mentality is still there, which is in complete contradiction to all the kind of the nationalist stuff that's there. But to your point, it's not a good bet. It's not, if I were I would like the United States to be the kind of country now that will make sure there is good governance in a neighbor, but I don't think we are. I don't think it's a good bet to assume that if we go crazy, the Americans are going to step in and save us. It's a gross misread of where U.S. domestic politics are. It's also a misread of where U.S. grand strategy is. And this is another set of conversations that we had in Mexico City, is that the United States has not had a Latin America strategy for 30 to 40 years. I mean, we just haven't. We've had this idea that the Western Hemisphere is going to be fine. There's been no reinforcement of our position. And so almost while we haven't been looking, the hemisphere has basically fallen away from us. It's leftist governments almost everywhere, I think, except in Panama, right? Like Panama,
I think it's the only one left.
Panama might, at least that's what we were told. I haven't gone through every Caribbean island on it, but all the major governments are left wing. You've seen the Brazilians, for example. The Chinese have been buying everything in their backyard for decades now.
Right.
And now they're going to do, I believe, yuan-denominated international trade and transfers, which means that the U.S. dollar is dethroned from its position of primacy in the hemisphere. There's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
And while we've been focused from a strategic perspective on Europe, which we should be, and on Asia, Latin America is slipping away. And I say slipping away not in the sense that it's ours to own, but we have a legitimate strategic interest in making sure that it is not a hostile region. And I don't think we can assume that anymore. And to anybody in Latin America who is, fighting for liberty or freedom or, what have you, and, God bless you for it, because it's a tough landscape. I say this with regret. I'm not sure you can count on the Americans coming through in the end. I just don't know that to be true.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's sad that that's happened, right?
Agree.
But I really quick want to shift gears. I think that we will continue to unpack a lot of the things that we've talked about in Mexico City. But something that I want to touch on is we often talk about a lot of the negative things with the Mexican government.
Oh, sure.
A lot of pessimistic views that we have for where that's going. But I kind of want to shift gears to something positive, and that's how much we loved being in Mexico City.
Oh, my gosh.
And I think that we can talk about all the negatives about the Mexican government, but daily life in Mexico is amazing, especially in Mexico City.
It is.
So I kind of want to get your thoughts on that, how much you liked it.
Yeah, I love it, honestly. And I've said this before, if I were at a different position in life, and I don't say this with regret because I'm very happy, but if I could advise someone in their 20s to go someplace very interesting, go to Mexico City.
Yeah,
it's not necessarily what you think. There is a large American expatriate community now in Mexico City. Principally in places like Roma Norte and Condesa, both of which are lovely neighborhoods. But if you go, I would avoid them. Honestly, I wouldn't avoid the neighborhoods, but I would avoid that community because it's they're sort of, as with a lot of expatriate life, expat life, there's a tendency to construct a bubble around. And so one of the things that kind of always rubbed me wrong, there's a nice little coffee shop, the one that we went to. It was right around the corner from where we were staying in Roma Norte. And you can sit there, and if I had a dime for every time I've heard this conversation. So you go there, you have some coffee, it's beautiful, and there's always the one table over, and it's these folks from California, and they always have the same conversation about how much they love Mexico, how crazy the U.S. is, just how things run better here, it's a better way of life, and this and that, and things like that, which, it's unrealistic. I mean, let's view things with realism. Governance in Mexico is much worse than anything you'll encounter in the United States. So that's one thing. The other part of it too is that there is, I hesitate to use the word because I'm not a left winger or a progressive, but there is a privilege in being able to get paid in dollars, to live in dollars, and so you're purchasing sort of this way of life that isn't necessarily reflective of what you see in Mexico City. But go elsewhere. Go to you go to Coyoacán, go to San Angel, go to do the walk up into I think Gustavo Madero, which is up north. Go to Iztapalapa, do it during the day because it's not the safest place to go. But go to these places and see what Mexico City is like. And I think what you'll find is this: you'll find the kind of urban life that has not existed in the United States, really, for maybe the past 70 years or so, depending on when you want to count it. This very neighborhood-based, very community-based sort of existence where there really is a variation in inheritance and sense of history and even local culture, almost from block to block as you go. And there's something very attractive about that. There's something very attractive about talking with people, as you and I did, who said, "Oh yeah, I grew up on this block. My dad lives around the corner. My grandfather is here. This is the school that I'm going to send my kids to, and they're around there." And that rootedness matters a ton. It really does, and it's something that I think that with kind of like American mobility, which has had many positive aspects to it, and you and I have certainly benefited from it, but at the same time we've lost that. We're both in Austin, and neither of us, I think it's fair to say, I mean, I know your neighborhood, but it's fair to say that neither of us could walk out of our front door and find that community on our block. It just doesn't exist. They're all transients like us from someplace else. And Mexico City still has that. Mexico City is also still a place where there is almost this, this is probably overstating it a bit, but it's almost this Paris in the 20s sort of, not just a cafe culture, but also this almost intellectual life culture. It's still a place where there is there's a robust, and I've gotten to partake of this as my Spanish has gotten better, but there's a robust like used books market, and so you can there's a whole street. It's San Justo, I think, in El Centro. Have you been on this street where it's all antiquarian book dealers?
I think I have. Yeah.
Have you? Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about,
We
right?
saw book festivals. Some of the most famous coffee shops are like,
We did.
big libraries.
Yes.
So, absolutely.
Right. Exactly. It's much more of a European sensibility and this belief that there is still this life of letters that goes on and really matters. And now in the United States, that whole clique of people has basically committed suicide, so they kind of deserve their fate in a way. But it's nice to see that there's a place that exists. It's nice that there's this environment where I can go to Fondo Cultural and run into Paco Ignacio Taibo, who again had zero interest in talking to me.
Right.
But I thought that's pretty cool, and that's something that I think the closest you could get to it in the United States would be New York City. But even New York City has effectively lost most of the qualities. There are some neighborhoods where you can still get that. Has lost most of the qualities that lent itself to that kind of life.
Oh yeah.
But man, honestly, if I wasn't so convicted, which again I say with regret, that Mexican governance writ large is descending into some very dark places, I would almost consider Mexico City to be a place where you could build the future. And I'll close with this because I could monologue on this for quite a while.
Right.
But I want your views too. Mexico City in particular, and a lot of what you see in Mexico is really a showcase for what the individual Mexican is capable of.
Yeah.
Despite everything that's gone wrong, the ingenuity, the labor, the kind of the patriotic care for place that exists in a place like that is almost an example to those of us in the United States who may have forgotten what those qualities look like, kind of on a local live level, and something very attractive about it. What do you think?
I think you're totally right. I think that a lot of the time, we've both loved Mexico City for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
We visited before for even just, leisure trips and family trips and all of that. And I think that once you come back here and you're learning about all the negative aspects of Mexico, it's kind of easy to lose sight of how amazing Mexico City is. But that's the thing. Mexico City is a bubble. And one of the conversations that I had in Mexico City was someone telling me, oh, yeah, it's very safe here. You don't have to worry about anything. People occasionally get pickpocketed, but it's very safe. Which I agree. I mean, we walked everywhere. We never felt unsafe. But that's intentional, right? And the person that I was talking to said that it's kind of unsigned, unspoken, unwritten agreement, because that's where the families of the politicians live. And that's even where the families of a lot of these drug kingpins and cartels members live.
Right.
So everybody sends their families to Mexico City. It's in a bubble. It's safe. It's great. Life is awesome. But that's not the rest of Mexico, right? Like the rest of Mexico is largely plagued with a lot of the things that we often talk about: violence, organized crime. They've lost a lot of the sovereignty that they used to have over their territory, but Mexico City is in kind of a bubble.
Yeah.
Have you heard that before? Because that was kind of surprising to me. I just figured, I don't know, I guess they just don't operate in Mexico City, but it's very intentional that's where the families live. They don't touch it. And then the rest of Mexico is kind of descending into chaos.
Yeah, I mean, I think and again, this is what I've been told, and my direct experience in Mexico is obviously limited to the border regions and Mexico City itself. So I haven't been around Guerrero or Michoacan or the Bajío or any place like that. But what I'm told is it's a patchwork, and you kind of have to know where to be, where you can go, and so on. But Mexico City was described to me in 2019 by an American political officer as, and this is his quote, "Gilded lilies on a sea of blood."
Gilded lilies.
Gilded
on a
lilies
sea of
on a sea of
blood.
blood. Yeah, which is extremely vivid and evocative,
Wow.
and I think that's probably true. So I can't say the extent to which it rings true to me that family members are there, political politicians' families are there, and that actually generates kind of this level of protection. But as with all things, that lasts until it doesn't. You can think back to the Mexican Revolution, and Mexico City was not untouched during the Mexican Revolution. I don't want to give that impression because there were, like the tragic days when Madero was killed, and General Huerta comes to power. Saw a lot of violence in the streets of Mexico City, but compared to what the rest of the country had to endure in that decade of revolution, Mexico City was actually largely a reasonably safe place to be, and that seems to be repeating itself now in the current Mexican civic breakdown. That the capital remains fine and a place that you and I feel quite safe going to.
Right.
So.
Well, hopefully it remains that way.
And the weather's beautiful.
Yeah.
The jacarandas are out.
Oh, it was the most perfect time to visit.
It is.
And I think that we could talk about that for a whole podcast as well, how much we love Mexico City. But I really want to take this back to AMLO and some of the current politics, because last week AMLO wrote a letter to the Chinese president asking him to stop fentanyl shipments from Chinese shores to Mexico. Did you see that?
Yes, of course, yeah.
So this letter was so interesting to me because a lot of the letter just consisted of some venting and complaining about the U.S., which didn't really seem relevant to the point of the letter. There was like a lot of throwing shade at the U.S., and I want to read you a quote.
Please.
First of all, he blamed the U.S. for the fentanyl crisis in it. And this is what he said. Unjustly, they are blaming us for problems that in large measure have to do with their loss of values, their welfare crisis. These positions are in themselves a lack of respect and a threat to our sovereignty. And moreover, they are based on an absurd, manipulative, propagandistic, and demagogic attitude. So I want to get your initial thoughts on this. He's still denying that fentanyl is made in Mexico, and now, but he's asking the Chinese to cooperate with that. But it's weird, right? Because his own administration has admitted that they found all these stash houses where they're producing fentanyl. So I'm confused. What do you think about this?
They've appointed a fentanyl czar. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amateur hour at the Palacio Nacional. I mean, there's no question about it. This is something that we heard over and over in our conversations. That policy making in Mexico. And you can sort of draw a loose parallel to like Trump tweets. There was this critique that it was President Trump's Twitter account that set policymaking for that White House, which was not as true as the critics like to say. But policymaking in Mexico really is almost fully limited to the president's mañaneras.
Yeah.
And this is an outgrowth of one of the mañanera kind of monologues that he did, which is this idea that, we're not responsible for fentanyl. It's because the Americans don't love their kids. It's because they have social breakdowns. But we're going to ask the Chinese for help in this, which is not actually how diplomacy is conducted. He does have a grain of truth in there that there are significant social ills in the United States that are leading to the fentanyl crisis. But it's, and you and I have talked about this, it's multi-causal. It can be simultaneously true that the United States has tremendous social problems, which we do, and that the Mexican state is complicit in shipping fentanyl to the United States, which is also true. And that's the part that AMLO wants to deny because his number one goal is to keep the Americans out. And you and I heard this again in our conversations that he's almost desperate to shift the spotlight from this because he knows, and everybody knows, that any digging into this is going to dredge up his own connections to the criminal cartels and his family's connections to the criminal cartels as well, which are robust, to say the least. So he sends this letter to the Chinese. The Chinese have already responded, and they basically said, "Oh yeah, we agree with you that the United States is bad." Everything that you would expect the communist Chinese to say. But then the Chinese have said, "Well, it's not us either," and so it's sort of this unproductive circle. But you have to keep in mind that none of this was done in the vein of actual diplomatic policy making. It's 100% for domestic consumption on AMLO's part, and so mission accomplished in that case.
Yeah, and I think no one wants to take responsibility. It's very easy to shift blame. And one other thing that the president recently was venting about is these new press reports that the NBA has been talking to the players union, and they had offered to stop testing or penalizing players for using marijuana.
Right.
So he grabbed onto this and talked about how the U.S. is morally and socially decaying. And he said, actually, we are seeing the basketball league has authorized players to smoke marijuana. How can that be? Imagine. It shouldn't be allowed anywhere. So, you know, Mexico itself has legalized marijuana, right, for medical use and all of these things. And they
Has it
have,
really? I didn't know that.
yeah,
Okay.
and they have a problem with, meth use as well. They're not immune to some of the problems that we have in the U.S., but
Sure.
he comes and he says that Mexico doesn't have a drug problem because of the tight-knit family system and all of these things. So it seems like he's flip-flopping a lot back and forth.
AMLO is this is one interesting facet of his personality. Even though he's empowered a ton of like real kind of lunatic progressives who were inspired by American progressivism within his administration. We talked about Scheinbaum. She's the tip of the iceberg. He himself is an aging 1970s like a personally. I want to be bounded in how I say this, but like a personally conservative guy. Like you'd never know it, but he's anti-abortion, like he's pro-life. He genuinely doesn't believe that you should smoke pot. He thinks it's something that's crazy to do. He really does believe in the extended family, and actually, the extended family for him is a substitute for a state welfare system. And these are a lot of positions that as like an American social conservative like me would tend to agree with in isolation. And so I think he's got, and to kind of pile it on top of that, this is implicit in his critique, but I do think that if you are in the Mexican state and society, you might have a just critique of, the Americans have been pressuring us for decades to eradicate marijuana consumption or marijuana production and shipping, but then here's the institutions of your society legalizing it. So why did we put our society through this on your behalf? And honestly, that's not an illegitimate critique. It really isn't. But as with all things AMLO, he's seizing upon the detail to obscure the larger point, which is that.
He's good at that.
Right. Well, he's a politician, but which is that he and his regime are part of the problem.
Yeah.
In this case. So.
Well, I know we're almost out of time, so I want to start wrapping up. But the last thing I want to ask you about really quickly, while it's relevant, is the event that we had here at the foundation last week. We had the Tejanos event about Tejano impact.
We did.
It was on Thursday. So you were on the panel. You had this super interesting conversation with some other people about the impact that Tejanos have had. And then we can tease this and kind of continue talking about it in the next podcast.
We'll put a link in the show description.
We should. And we also unveiled some of the new research that we've been working on, our Mexican migration project. Could you kind of surface level give a summary of that, and then we can tease it and talk about it in the next podcast?
We talked about a little bit of the draft of it. So this is not public research yet, but we do have a draft of this Mexican migration project. And what we ended up doing was looking at which Mexicans in each of the 50 U.S. states came from where. And so one of the theses that I had was that Texas has a qualitatively different profile of kind of Mexican ingress into Texas versus other states.
Right.
And I think we might have talked about this on previous podcasts. I don't remember exactly. So may the listeners pardon us if that is so. But my thesis was that Texas probably got Mexicans from sort of this northeastern tier, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, Coahuila, and that California and the rest of the U.S. states really got southern Mexicans, Oaxacans, Chiapas, Michoacan, so maybe Jaliscienses to some extent. And anyway, to kind of fast forward, and you'll see this when we release the research, and to my knowledge, we're the only institution, academic or otherwise, that has done any research like this. As that has turned out to be true. Texas Mexicans in Texas tend to have their origins in Tamaulipas. And then in the Bajío, which is sort of this broadly defined norteño area that is culturally quite different than the southern tier of Mexican states that really send their Mexicans to their populations to places like California and things like that. And so one of the things that we're still diving into is, and this is going to be like a second stage of research, is does that have social and political effects? I think it obviously does, and I think it's partially explanatory of why you see this conservative renaissance and this rightward movement of Mexican Americans in Texas, but you don't see it in a place like California.
Right.
Probably because there's a different cultural background. And again, this is something that relies upon the incredible heterogeneity of Mexican society to sort of vindicate and express itself. So it's very exciting. We're just at the beginning, and I'm looking forward to releasing the research.
We have to continue unpacking it. Yeah. Thank you, Josh. And I'll make sure to link the panel for all of our listeners to be able to watch. But thank you, Josh, for your time. We have a lot that we need to continue to talk about, but that's all for today. And thank you to all of our listeners for listening to The Hard Country. We'll see you next time.